Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Melvin Varghese of the Selling the Couch podcast about entrepreneurs and dating and how time crunched they are, how stressed they are, and how that affects our dating lives. Subscribe to BetMeADate on YouTube for new videos every Sunday and Thursday at 6 p.m. on dating challenges that can be difficult to overcome. I'm Dr. Aviva Gaskill. I'm a clinical psychologist who's helped dozens of patients overcome dating challenges, but I can't do this work alone. I do it with the help of experts like Dr. Melvin Varghese. Welcome, everybody. Today I've got with me Dr. Melvin Varghese from the Selling the Couch podcast, and he's going to be talking with us about entrepreneurs and dating. How do the time crunched date? So Dr. Varghese, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Yes, of course, Dr. Gaskell, thank you again for having me on. So yeah, back in 2015, I launched a blog and a podcast called Selling the Couch. And honestly, it was out of conversations I had with two fellow colleagues about how to launch a successful practice. But I think there was always this entrepreneur side of me and that I didn't quite realize was there. And basically, the podcast focused on how all of us that are in the mental health field and healthcare can can take some of those business lessons that we often don't pick up during grad school, learn from others. And so on the podcast, I interview successful practitioners, I interview social media folks, I interview marketing folks, just to be able to share those insights. And the podcast has been going since 2015. We just passed 260 episodes.
Wow.
And a pretty big milestone this past
Yeah.
year of 1 million total downloads, which has been pretty unreal. And yeah, it's been nice. I think I've fortunately been able to launch some products and things and services as an offshoot of the blog, and so it's primarily where I spend the majority of my time in entrepreneur mode. I also have a small private practice where I serve entrepreneurs and startups, particularly ones who are successful but unfulfilled. So,
Which is such an interesting niche. So, and unusual for mental health providers. So I'm wondering, what are some personality traits or patterns that you see that exist in the world of entrepreneurs?
yeah, I mean, and even the word entrepreneurs, I mean, there's like so many nuances to that term, right? Like there's, folks that might be like an entrepreneur like part-time, or they might be solopreneurs, or they might be
Mhm.
part of like a startup or something like that, right?
Yeah.
But I think in general, some of the qualities that I've noticed with folks that I work with, as well as even within myself, is one, I think just a sense of independence. They not just like an independent, like I'm going to do my own thing, but almost like an independent spirit, always wanting to kind of push the envelope and see how can I look at something a little bit differently.
Mhm.
The next thing I
It's a
would say
little
is
little rebellious streak.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Good
definitely like a
touch.
yes, a touch of rebelliousness, and I like to call it confined rebelliousness,
Yeah.
hopefully. So, yeah, definitely looking at the status quo and saying like, hey, how can I think about this differently, kind of thing.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. What else? You were there. It sounds like there's some other traits there
yeah,
that
yeah,
exist.
I
Yeah.
would say like, I mean, I kind of, thought about a couple of different ones. So the other one I think is like self-sufficiency, which we'll
Mm.
definitely dive into because I think this is kind of the double-edged sword for a lot of entrepreneurs in
Yeah.
that they're very industrious, they're able to figure out things and solutions, but in relationships that can sometimes kind of get in the way. So, and then
Yes.
so yeah, no, I know that you definitely, having the clients and folks that you work with, I know you resonate with that as well.
Yeah.
Um, I would say probably the last two things are just like generally motivated. So they're go-getters. They don't need much like, hey, you should be doing this kind of thing. And then yeah, I guess I would just say innovators. So folks that are, out of the box thinkers, folks that, may look at something and say, instead of, okay, this does this, or this is how I can do it. Maybe it's like, how can I do it differently? That's sort of the question they're more likely to ask. So,
Yes, yes, definitely. I would agree 100%. And it's funny, so I went to art school before I became a psychologist.
oh, I
And
didn't
I
know
went,
that.
yeah, and I went to school with the guys who started Airbnb, two of the guys who started Airbnb.
Wow.
Um, and the school that I went to,
Mm,
RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, is, like known for busting out of the box. And people don't
mm,
necessarily associate art school with that entrepreneurial spirit, but to me, like it emanates from everywhere in that space because everything we do is completely busting open the box.
yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's almost like in that situation, right? Almost an environment is being created where, yeah, it's almost like the foundations are being laid there,
Yeah.
I would imagine.
Yeah. So tell me, what are some dating challenges in particular that you find in this population?
Yeah, it's a good question. You shared some of these like thoughts with me before, and so I had a chance to even like think and even reflect a lot, and I came up with four of them. So maybe what I can do is like go through them, and we can dive a little bit deeper.
Yeah, that'd be
How does
great.
that sound?
Yeah.
Okay. So the first one is like independence gets in the way.
Mm.
The second one is like emotional vulnerability. So the tension about like what to show as an entrepreneur in the entrepreneurial space versus
Hmm.
what's often expected or hoped for in relationships.
Yeah.
That third one I would say is the struggle to balance like your business significant other with your significant
Yeah.
other.
Yeah.
And then the fourth one I think is just perfectionism.
Yeah.
I know it's something even I struggle with, but as an entrepreneur. So
Yeah, definitely. So, so tell us, like, let's go back to number one. Tell
yeah.
us a little bit about how you see that playing out.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, like with that idea of like independence getting in the way,
Hmm.
um, a common phrase that I often hear is like, why do I need to rely on someone else when I'm so used to figuring out everything and getting things
Hmm.
done, you know? And so I think this is, I'm a big fan of like just, like mindfulness and sort of Eastern thought. And I think it's so easy, I think, for entrepreneurs to say, okay, I can translate this mindset. This mindset works for me in the entrepreneurial space,
Hmm.
and thus it has to work for me in other areas, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah, I'm trying to superimpose
yep.
like my work life and my home life.
Yeah, right. Like it's almost like, and it's interesting too, because it's almost like, hey, that's my superpower normally as an entrepreneur. So
Mhm.
why does this not work out,
Yeah.
And why can't I get it to work out in
Yeah.
other scenarios? So
And it sounds like it can feel a lot, like for a lot of folks that this independent streak is a lot of, squeezing a square peg into a round hole
hmm.
a lot of times.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's like really well put.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it makes me think about the vulnerability piece, not to jump ahead, but
Mm,
what you were saying about that too, like, um, you know, I have to be poker faced, right? I can't
mm,
put all my cards out at work, especially
yeah,
if there's a big deal going on or
yeah,
something like that. And so when, I'm at home, how am I supposed to transfer into somehow then suddenly being this vulnerable person or this open
mm,
person or this person who connects?
yeah.
And that's
That's
scary too. It sounds
right.
scary.
It is really scary, especially when so many entrepreneurs spend so many hours, like, I wouldn't say like perfecting that poker face, but I could think to some degree, right? Because of what they're used to. And then having to say, like, hey, that actually doesn't work in other areas of your life, that
Yeah.
well. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. To that point as well, like, we talked about like the emotional vulnerability. And I think the thing I was thinking a lot about, I feel like the entrepreneurial space is moving away from this, but the usual stereotype has always been this is like the hustle and grind culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't you show up, you know, you work really hard, you do whatever it takes to get this business working and successful, but you at the same time, like, you don't express like hard emotions, right? Like anxiety or sadness or fear. And so it's this like, you know, and even like things like despair, right? Which I know, you
Mm-hmm.
know, I mean, anyone that's in the entrepreneurial space, it's like this emotional roller coaster that, you know, can switch within minutes, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so it's an interesting tension between you have to be focused and relationships call for
Yeah.
vulnerability. So,
Yeah. 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 And I don't know. Do you find that, I don't know if this is necessarily the case, but I'm thinking about someone who is quite a bit type A.
mm,
And I'm wondering if you see some of those traits, and how those, again, sort of don't work in the dating space for that person, or they may not work in a romantic space.
yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's like a lot of overlap between sort of type A personalities and entrepreneurial
Yeah.
personalities, if we're going to call it that, right? Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I guess, going back to that point we talked about earlier. I think it's very easy for entrepreneurs to say, like, this is the mindset that has served me well in work, and so why would it not serve me well in other parts of my life, kind of
Mhm.
thing, you know?
Mhm.
And yeah, it's a tough, like, it's a definitely a tough and not an easy thing to navigate, which is why, like, I think one of the things I, you know, started to mention earlier was, like, I'm a big fan of like incorporating things like mindfulness, because
Yeah.
like just the fact that you can sort of recognize like, hey, this is my mindset when I'm an entrepreneur, and here's how that is playing out in other parts, and, you know,
Yeah.
and being able to just observe that instead of just saying like, just doing it, you know, without thinking through it or thinking
Yeah.
about it.
Well, and again, what strikes me about mindfulness, and even with folks who, again, either are type A or
Mm,
entrepreneurs, and again, I know not everybody is both,
mm,
but that sometimes it's just taking the focus onto something else, right? Like in mindfulness, one of the things that is often talked about is just shifting the focus onto your breath, right?
mm.
From whatever's going on, otherwise in your head. And I wonder about, um, you know, what people can do, and can they shift the focus in some way? Can they use some technique of mindfulness, or some piece of mindfulness to shift focus,
Mm.
and change what they thought was what they were driving towards to be something else? What do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I would say even like there's been two things, and we'll definitely like cover this a little bit later, but I feel like as I've grown as an entrepreneur, there's been two things that have been really valuable. You know, initially I thought, you know, hiring a team and all of those things. So, you know, like with my blog, I have right now um 4 5 independent contractors that, you know, I outsource different parts, right?
Hmm.
Podcast editing, website design. I have a general VA, video
Hmm.
editor, that kind of stuff, right? Um, and I think hiring a team is really important. But I think this past year, especially with this pandemic, I realized like two things. One is like my morning routine, and specifically like having a good like mindfulness or meditation routine. Like, for example, I use like Headspace, right? Just doing that on a daily basis, I think is so important. And then the other thing is just doing your own like personal therapy. Like, you know, I've been in therapy multiple times in my life. And especially this year, I got back into it because I just noticed it was getting really overwhelming trying to
Yeah.
manage, you know, like the volatility of this pandemic when
Yeah.
you superimpose that on business kind of stuff too, you know?
Yeah. On general business, and then the particular business that we're in,
Yeah.
as mental health providers too.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. It's been
Yeah.
intense.
Uh, Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because like I think the entrepreneur side of me, I'm like, oh, I went to grad school on this stuff. Like I can handle my own emotions, right? Like but there was like, I don't know, it's made me like a just like a new believer, again
Mhm.
in the power of therapy. I mean, I really believe that every entrepreneur, and even just when I've talked to like very successful entrepreneurs, the theme that often comes up is, it's not like about your funnels and systems and your team. Like those are important, but really it's your ability to handle the ups and downs of entrepreneurship. And especially
Mm.
when, you have your own trauma and all of those different things, and not letting those bleed into your business so that you're making decisions based on like business data as opposed to like, trauma, for example.
So how do you not let them bleed into your dating life? Because they're gonna,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially right now with what's going on. How do you handle dating issues as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I don't know about you, but it's not exactly like we were given a manual on how to handle pandemics and volatility that comes with it. But yeah, I would say like in terms of just handling the unique stressors. So again, I think one would be really just having I have a very regimented morning routine that includes like things like journaling, mindfulness, a time for me to kind of just focus.
Mhm.
And I feel like it's such a vital thing for things like relationships. So, I'm married, and I feel like one of the things that has been really helpful is my morning routine helps me to be more present for my wife,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And so even I think that same idea I think translates really well when you're dating, right? Like having a
Mm.
very established morning routine helps you, I think, to more tune into what you're going through, what you're struggling with, the emotions that are coming up,
Mhm.
and making sure, even like for me, for example, if something doesn't work out in the business and I am like stressed or irritated about that, right? And just being mindful of those emotions so that, if my partner, we have a disagreement later, being able to say, you know what, like I'm already probably a little bit like elevated, and just being
Mhm.
mindful to say, maybe she didn't mean it at the level that you're hearing it or understanding it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So just having that established morning time that works for you, that settles you into your day, it sounds like even towards the very end of the day can really
Mhm.
help you to be less reactionary
Yeah.
and just approach things from a different headspace. And that I think that's important because I think
Mhm.
some people think, oh, well, it can help a little bit during the day, but then it fades. And it does, but it overall and over time,
Yeah.
it sounds like, when you talk to people who practice mindfulness on a regular basis, they say it really does help them be in a
Yeah.
better headspace, even by the end of the day. Stick around for more of Dr. Varghese's insights on working with entrepreneurs and dating.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think related to this, like one thing I started doing was, especially this year with this pandemic, I used to look at my days and try to think of like all of my to-do lists, right? And
Mhm.
try to chat and try to almost see my days as when I get to the end, how many things have I checked off from my to-do list? And I guess both determine like my self-worth based on that, and then sort
Mhm.
of my business accomplishment based on that.
Mhm.
But one thing I've really, and this is such a growth area for me too, like one thing I've tried to do this year is say, look at this a little bit more holistically, right? So there's
Yeah.
like business health, there's my physical health, there's like my emotional health, and then there's like the health with my partner,
Yeah.
like my relational health, right? So even, and this is like a broad kind of framework, but what I usually do is my mornings are dedicated to kind of deep work. My lunch hour, I grab a hike, as long as the weather cooperates here in
Mhm.
Philly, which is could be spotty right now, but um, usually do a hike, I do a power nap, and then my afternoons I try to spend just a couple of hours for learning time
Yeah.
because I really just appreciate like, figuring out and learning new things. And then again, this wasn't possible early on, but one thing I've really tried to here do in the last couple of years is I wrap up the day by 5,
Yeah.
because I just feel like early on, what I would do is I would convince myself I just need to get a little bit more done. I feel so
Mhm.
much better if I
Yeah.
do it, but the reality is like, if I don't set those boundaries, like me setting that boundary at 5 o'clock, it's actually setting me up for the next day.
Yeah.
Right.
So, how does that work in dating? This piece with being mindful of your boundaries.
Yeah.
What can people who are entrepreneurs in the dating world do
Mhm.
to set up good boundaries for themselves?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So I think it's a great question. So I think in terms of setting boundaries for themselves, so one is um, realizing like your own what I would say is like your hard emotions
Hmm.
that show up, right? And noticing that pattern.
Hmm.
um I think in particularly in relationships, I think for entrepreneurs, I, I keep going back to this, but I keep finding that vulnerability is sort of the antidote to a
Yeah.
lot of what entrepreneurs struggle with, right?
Yeah.
It's such a new skill for many, right? But I think the ability to be open and honest in dating, right? So for example, entrepreneurs have like unique stressors, right? You may be in the middle of a launch, or you may have some, you're going through like a funding round or something like that, or you're working with an angel investor. There's like so many moving parts, and seeing your partner as someone that can help walk you through that, as opposed to someone that isn't maybe like getting in the way of you focusing on that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I'm also wondering, like, what if you don't have a partner and you'd like to have one, right? This
Yeah.
loneliness piece.
Yeah.
Because I imagine that comes up for a lot of folks who are entrepreneurs too. I don't
Yeah.
have time to date. I don't have
Yeah.
space for it. They don't get set good boundaries for
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good point. So I would probably say I'm like a big fan of like values work, right?
Mhm.
So really thinking about outside of this entrepreneur space, what are the things that are the most important to me,
Mhm.
right? And let's say like in this scenario, like if relationships and meaningful relationships are important, right? I think in the same way that we might schedule, I mean, this may be a little too like um regimented, but I feel like, I think entrepreneurs resonate with the fact of like what doesn't get scheduled doesn't get done,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So that whole idea of even like whether it's setting aside time to go on a dating app or
Mm.
whatever that is, right? And or setting aside a block of time to say, hey, this is when I'm going to go to dinner. I actually came across this pretty interesting article, like a bunch of different articles. And one of the suggestions they made in that article was uh, like, think of, and this is post pandemic, but think of like a common place that you would go and like just have like your meetings and slash like uh, dates there, especially
Mhm.
initial dates, so that you're sort of just almost like it's into the flow of your schedule, which I thought was an
Mm.
interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, it is interesting. It is interesting.
Um,
Yeah, and I feel like there's so many workspaces now that a lot
mhm.
of like startups and entrepreneurs
Yeah,
sort of hit up that like it actually could be a really fun and interesting place to both meet someone and also,
yeah,
um, is an important place for you to be in
yeah.
potentially.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, yeah, like a lot of these co-working spaces also have like social events now, because
Mhm.
they've realized like how important that is. And so, yeah, I think co-working spaces are like really good. really good
Yeah.
areas, definitely for sure.
Yeah. What other tips do you have for folks who, whether they're already in a relationship or they're, just starting out and trying to date, but are, overwhelmingly busy entrepreneurs? I was thinking about this vulnerability piece, like,
Mm.
because we do keep going back to that. Um, how do you get vulnerable, right? Okay, so looking at the hard feelings, but we can look at the hard feelings and go like, I don't want to,
Mhm.
I don't want to be there,
Yeah.
right? Like if they're
Yeah.
not comfortable to sit in.
Yeah. For me, and I can just share like what's been helpful for me. I think what I realized is the hard emotions are so vital to my own personal and business success, right? And my
Mhm.
ability to handle those like hard emotions. So, for
Mm,
example,
yeah,
like anxiety is something I really struggle with, right?
yeah.
But if I don't learn to notice when my anxiety comes up, and I don't notice like how I respond to anxiety,
Mhm,
it can impact, for example, things like business decisions, right? So I make a decision based on fear as opposed
mhm.
to information, you know,
Yeah.
or in dating relationships, right? Um, you make a decision based on the fear of having no one,
Mhm.
right? So you may get into a relationship that may not be the best for you, you know?
Yeah. I was thinking, you know, and I know that this happened for me recently, that I wasn't acting
Mm,
on some things that I needed to do for this new business for
mm,
BetMeADate that
mm,
I'm working on because of fear. And so when I was able to actually, um, face the fear and just do it, right? That um, I stopped putting it off. And I feel like it would be, I was imagining myself if I was dating, thinking, wow, like it would be so easy to
yeah,
put it off and not face the fear of putting yourself out there and dating.
yeah,
Um, and just sort of say, and I hear a lot of people say this, whether the entrepreneurs or not, I don't have time. I don't
mhm,
have the time for that.
yeah,
Um, and I feel like that's such an easy go-to. So
yeah.
what do you think about that piece, the time and
Y
the fear?
Yeah, I mean, I do, it's an interesting tension because, like, especially, I'm a couple of years now into the entrepreneurial journey,
Mhm.
and but I remember those beginning years, and that phrase was so true. I mean, literally, I woke up, I think, the first, like, several months at, like, 3:50 AM or something, so I could
Yeah.
work on this, while and then I was at a group practice at the time, so, I would get on the 8 something train to go into Center City, and see clients, and then I would come back. Unfortunately, we didn't have a baby at the time, but
Yeah.
then I would come back and, work on it for a couple hours and then do that whole thing over and over. So I understand like the not having the time.
Yeah.
I'm just wanted to kind of share, I guess, from my perspective, like the advice that I would maybe give to the future self, maybe.
Yeah.
I think now one of the things that I realize is uh, like your business is only one part of your life,
Yeah.
right? And I think where a lot of entrepreneurs, and it's so easy because it's your business, it's your baby, right? Like you've likely birthed this
Mhm.
thing, the struggle, what you've gone through, right?
Yeah.
Very few people understand that. But one thing I learned is that um, this one part of your life, right? And one of the challenges of entrepreneurship is to not make it your whole life and your
Mhm.
whole identity, right? And so your ability, I think, for example, like relationships, like whether it's a dating relationship or even like friendships, right? Like that's such an important part of your growth as an entrepreneur because
Yeah.
it helps you set things like boundaries,
Yeah.
right? It helps you figure out what to prioritize in your business.
Yeah.
Like if have this amazing project that's going to do awesome, but it's going to come at the expense of like significant other, right?
Yeah.
That's something to weigh, you know?
Yeah. And I think, I know for me, I've had some of my best ideas when I was hanging out with some of my closest friends,
Mm,
and just, relaxing or out on walks
yeah.
or doing things like that.
Yep.
Um, and one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you too is you're so, I mean, and appropriately so, right? You're so, especially in the journey that you've been on, you've become so much more thoughtful about your
Mm,
time and how you use it. And
yeah.
I really so appreciate you sharing that journey with us, and
Mm,
also, how people can use what you've gone through and sort of learned from yourself, and your relationship with your spouse in terms of, bringing that to their own dating life. So thank you so much for speaking with us today. um, where can people who are interested in learning more about you, finding out more about you, hear more about you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, no, Viva, thank you again. I really am just so grateful for our friendship, and thank you for even thinking of me. You can find me a couple of different places. So the podcast, the blog, that's over at sellingthecouch.com, and then my private practice site is over at melvinvarghese.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we'll link to that in the notes.
Perfect.
And don't forget to check us out on betmeadate.com to meet all of your dating goals. Like, subscribe, ring the bell, and check out more of our content on YouTube from Bet Me a Date.